So the topic tonight is reunification. We might say reconciliation. And I think this becomes an extremely important topic because there has been in the Tanakh a tremendous rift in Jacob's family. And the question is it possible to repair that rift? And I'll just point out, I originally thought I was going to do this, but maybe we'll save it for another time. One of the things which is actually interesting to compare is the meeting after 20 plus years between Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esau, with the meeting after 20 plus years between Joseph and his brothers. And both meetings have the potential to be very explosive. And the question is, will they explode? Will they bring about a reconciliation? Or perhaps a third option, which is in fact what happens in the case of Yaakov and Esav. So without any further ado, let's look at what happens in our parsha. But before we look at our parsha, it's worth noting what appears at the end of last week's parsha. And in fact, this would make a great Hollywood TV series, okay, where you leave the end of at the end of a particular episode, right, in suspense. You're waiting to see what's going to happen. So at the end of last week's parsha, okay, Joseph, in his capacity, in his role as the second to Pharaoh, as this extremely powerful figure in Egypt, plants his cup in Benjamin's sack and subsequently sends his messenger to look for it and accuses the brothers of stealing his cup. When in fact the cup is discovered, okay, the brothers offer to all become Joseph's servants / slaves. And Joseph's response, okay, at the very last verse in last week's parsha, you can see this in chapter 44, verse 17. When the brothers say to Joseph, let us all be your servants, Joseph's response is, Chalilali, okay, forbidden, like forfend me. The idea being this would be a kind of even desecration, that I would do such a thing. And what he essentially says is, the person who actually took the cup, he will be my slave, and you, and the term that's used is go in peace up to your fathers, which is another way of saying, go back to where you were, okay, and everything is fine. I have no account with you. And so we'll be looking now at the opening section of our parsha, which is in effect this showdown, if you will, between Judah and Joseph, Judah as the representative of the brothers. Okay, and it's worth noting, Joseph knows fully well these are his brothers. The brothers have no clue that this is in fact Joseph. And let's do a careful reading because I want to show you a number of different levels of how to look at the story. So it begins by saying, Vayigash elav Yehuda. And Judah came near to him. Okay, and the expression of coming near to someone, okay, is not just, and I think I've said this on other occasions, it's not just a geographical move. Okay, there's something which is much more at stake here. When I come in close proximity, that can be an expression of intimacy. It could also be an expression of intimacy, which can actually be, right, a hostile confrontation. And so the question is, when Judah is now coming near to Joseph, towards what end? And for those of you who have my sheet, towards the bottom of the first page, I actually brought a Rashi from Bereshit, chapter 18, verse 23, which speaks about Abraham coming near to God. And the context is that God has just told him he's about to destroy Sodom. And then Abraham approaches God. And Rashi there makes a very interesting comment. He says that we have some places where we find coming close, approaching, as being in a context of warfare, which would be what we would call today hand-to-hand combat. Of reconciliation. And Rashi there quotes our verse. Are people with me? Because I saw it said on my screen, my internet is unstable.
Yeah, so, you're floating in and out a little bit. Yes.
Okay, I hope that it will be okay. So just let me know if so let me just repeat what I just said. That, yes, in other words,
thank you.
That Rashi in Breshit, when Avraham is approaching, in effect, to start arguing with God on behalf of the people of Sodom, Rashi brings our verse as a kind of source text, that coming near is for the purpose of reconciliation. Which means that Rashi, in effect, is reading what's about to happen as Judah somehow trying to bring about a reconciliation with Joseph, but not Joseph, the Egyptian, master, and to try to find a resolution of this difficult situation, in what we would call a very peaceful manner.
You know, Rabbi, English, so he approaches him, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking, Rashi is meaning it's a rapprochement. So it's sort of a combination of those words. So approach and rapprochement.
Absolutely. So again, that's what I'm saying. Is it a rapprochement or is it something else? And here Rashi is seeing it as that type of. Now again, what we're speaking about is a rapprochement between this Jewish family and this Egyptian lord. But in fact, there's something which is much bigger, which is about to happen, which is it's not just between Joseph as the Egyptian lord, but Joseph as their brother. Okay, so this is something which I would like to now see, this approach in the verses. And so let's look at what Yehuda says. And the opening section is really a very, very beautiful section in terms of how Judah pleads his case. So let's start, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. Vayomer bi Adoni, he says, please my master. Okay, note throughout that they refer to Joseph as the master, which is very appropriate because Joseph is this very powerful figure from their perspective, not only theirs, from everyone's perspective in that context. He is the second to Pharaoh. By using the word be is please. And I would venture to say that what he's doing is asking permission to just present his case. And if you look at how he continues, he says, Yedaber davar bo'oznei Adoni ve'al yichar abcha ba'avdecha ki chamocha kefaro. And right now, I want to read this on what we would call the pshat level. And the pshat level is that he says, may your servant now please speak before my master. Don't be angry at your servant. Well, why would Joseph be angry? So the simple pshat is that Joseph just said what the law will be. Joseph just gave the verdict. He said, you people go back in peace. He will be my servant. So why are you now trying to reopen the situation? The discussion is like a non-starter. So, but Judah is persisting and pleading with Joseph. Let me just get in this last pitch, if you will, for changing what your decision. And what Judah, in effect, is saying to Joseph is, I recognize who you are. You are like Pharaoh. You are an extremely powerful individual. I'm not trying to in any way challenge, undermine your authority. So now let's look at what is he doing. So he then goes on and in effect is kind of giving a little history of their interactions. And he's in effect saying, and here I'll just maybe translate it as we go along, unless I feel that there's a need to make note of the Hebrew. He says that when we originally came to you, you asked us, do we have a father? Do we have a brother? We told you we have an old father. We have a very young child who is born at an old age to our father. His brother died. He was left alone to his mother. His father hates him. Loves him, excuse me. That was just to see if you're awake, paying attention. But you see what Judah is doing. Judah, he's telling the truth. But what Judah is doing is very much trying to play up to somehow arouse his compassion. And by saying that our father is old, this is like a child who is a very special child. They have a very special relationship. And perhaps there was another brother who also had a special relationship who's no longer there. And then what he says is, and you told us, bring him down. I want to look at him. And we told you he can't leave his father. If he leaves the father, he's going to die, right? So it's as if what he's saying is, look, we never wanted to bring this brother down, okay? And not only that, but this brother is so special that our father didn't want him to go. If he would go, so then something could happen and our father could die if anything happens to him. And then what he says is to him, right? But you said to us, no, he must come down because otherwise you can't see me anymore. And when we came back and we told our father everything, so our father said to us, go back, get us a little bit of food. And then we explained to him, right? In other words, no, it doesn't work that way. If our younger brother will go, we can go down because this man has been insistent and says that, okay, we cannot come down without our younger brother. And then he says, and our father, your servant said, you know that my wife bore me 2 children and one of them has left me. And I thought, and I am under the impression that he has been torn apart. I haven't seen him. And if you take this one and something will happen, right? I will go down to the grave in tremendous, I'll translate, this is my license, right? In tremendous grief. And then Judah comes to the punchline, verses 30 and 31. Okay? And now if I come to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with me, and their souls are bound together, when he sees that the lad is not there, he will die. And we will have brought the old age of our father, your servant, in anguish to the grave. Now, it's clear from the way Judah presents his whole story that he's trying to play on Joseph's heartstrings, that he's very much trying to appeal to his compassion. And especially because Joseph was the one who asked them, do you have a father? And they explained to him their father is old. And they even explained to him that they can't bring down this younger brother, how much this younger brother means to their father. And here is Judah who's repeating it. But what he's adding here is that there's absolutely no question that if we return without this brother, our father will die and go down to the grave in tremendous anguish and grief. And so the question is, can this somehow appeal to Joseph to be willing to exercise some sort of clemency? And then Judah has the final step, which is not just have compassion, but in a certain sense, a kind of quid pro quo. And then he explains how he has taken personal responsibility for this boy. And then in verse 33 and 34, he says, let me now be in place of this boy, a servant to my master, and let the boy go up. Because how can I possibly go to my father and witness the evil that will befall him? So that if you look at what Judah does over here, he does everything to present what we would call a very convincing argument for Joseph exercising compassion. One might even say that Judah here is even proposing what could be seen as a much better deal, because presumably Judah is physically much stronger than Benjamin, much more capable than Benjamin, and so that it's to Joseph's benefit to take him as a servant rather than Benjamin. But essentially what Judah is doing is trying to appeal to his compassion for an old man who he seemed to take a certain interest in. And so this is the idea of Judah approaching for the purpose of reconciliation. Judah, according to the pshat of the pasuk, in no way is challenging Joseph, in no way is threatening Joseph. If anything, Judah keeps on saying again and again, I am the servant, you are the master. And for those of you who've heard me speak about this before, this echoes the way that Jacob spoke to Esav when he encounters him after a very long period of time. But in this case, it's very appropriate. And Judah saying, I'm not here to challenge you. I'm not here to in any way make any trouble. I'm here to appeal to the mercy of someone who seems to have mercy. Now that is, as I said, the pshat. And the reason why I'm playing this up so much is because on one level, here is Judah talking to Joseph as the Egyptian lord. But on another level, here is Joseph, who is also hearing this as their brother. And when Joseph hears this as their brother, Joseph, in effect, is hearing, okay, he's hearing, first of all, about his father who's still alive. He's hearing about how much Benjamin means to his father. He's seeing how much Judah is prepared to put everything on the line to save Benjamin. And I will say right now, perhaps in contrast to what Judah did when Judah was the one who suggested that they sell Joseph, here is Judah who's not prepared to sell out Benjamin, which means that Judah now, through the lenses not of the Egyptian lord, but of the brother, perhaps sees that now is the moment which is ripe for a reconciliation with his brothers. Now, I want to perhaps develop this a little bit. If you go back to last week's parsha, there are two comments which appear in last week's parsha, which might also begin to give Joseph the sense that the moment is ripe for a reconciliation. If you look in chapter 43, when Joseph accuses the brothers of being spies, and in effect says to them, if you want to prove your innocence, you have to go down and bring back your younger brother. This is chapter 42, verse 21. 42:21. So when the brothers hear, right, Joseph accusing them of being spies, when the brothers hear that in effect they cannot come back unless they bring Benjamin, their reaction is Vayomru ish el achiv. One brother says to the other, Aval ashemim anachnu. We are guilty al achinu, regarding our brother. Asher ra'inu tzarat nafsho. We saw the stress of his soul. Bitchanano elenu, when he pleaded to us, v'lo shamanu, we didn't hear. Al kain ba'a elenu hatzarazo, and therefore this difficulty is now coming upon us. Now, what are they referring to? Clearly, they're referring to when they threw Joseph into the pit. Clearly, they're referring to the fact when they had thought early and very seriously entertained the possibility of killing him. And at the time, this wasn't mentioned, but they are now saying it. And he begged us, he pleaded with us, and we did not hear him. We were cruel. And now we're getting paid back for it. Now, they also use the term, we're guilty. It's not like we made a mistake. We did something which was brutal, which means that what Joseph is overhearing now and again, they're saying this among themselves, and their assumption is he doesn't know what they're talking about because he's an Egyptian lord and he has a translator. But he overhears it. And as Joseph, their brother, he hears that they have this tremendous feeling of guilt, remorse for what they did, and realize the severity of what they did to him. And then if we look at the end of last week's parsha, a few verses, the verse, in fact, before the one I quoted, this is chapter 44, verse 16. When Joseph says to them, to the brothers, how could you take my cup? Judah's response in 44:16 is, what can we say to our master? How can we justify this? God has found the sin of your servants. Well, what sin has God found? I mean, Judah, in effect, is saying that God is now punishing us for what we did. Well, he doesn't say it explicitly, but clearly he's thinking the same thing. We sinned grievously against Joseph. And now think about it. We sold him as a slave. And now here is the measure for measure. We sold him as a slave, and now we need to become slaves. So what am I trying to point out? These two incidents become indicators to Joseph, the brother, that his brothers clearly have that sale of Joseph, and not only the sale, but I think it goes far beyond that, especially when you look at the verses I quoted you, that in fact the whole way in which they treated Joseph, this tremendous cruelty that they displayed, that this is weighing heavily on them. Not to mention also the impact which it had on Jacob, which I think comes across maybe in the opening verses of our parsha, how much Jacob has been affected by what happened. And that they feel a tremendous sense of guilt, accountability, to the extent that they're even prepared to pay the price for what they have done. Now, I bring all that up because this may also answer a question which many people, are troubled by. And that is, the moment that Joseph gets out of prison, the moment Joseph becomes this very, very powerful individual, so why doesn't Joseph just send someone and tell Jacob back home, Daddy, you'll never believe it, I'm alive and well, and not only alive and well, but in fact, I've really made it in Egypt, and things are great. So I'm sorry it took this long to get in touch with you, but I just want you to know everything is wonderful. And that's a very difficult question. Why doesn't Joseph get in touch with his family? But I think the answer is very simple. Because on the one hand, here is Joseph, who would like to see his father and maybe see his father and to somehow come back and to be together with his father. But on the other hand, Joseph has no idea how will his brothers react. And Joseph is very afraid that if he gets in touch with them prematurely, that could lead to an explosion. And therefore, Joseph is somehow waiting for the right moment to be able to bring about that reconciliation. And the right moment is, from his perspective, when he sees that the brothers are actually open to a reconciliation, when the brothers are open to what we would say honing up to what they did so that they can now come back together again. Which means that to be able to have a reconciliation, it means that people have to be able to perhaps take responsibility for things which they did, to acknowledge maybe the pain which was caused, and to be able to thereby find a way of moving forward. And so what I would say is that given what Joseph has seen in last week's parsha, and certainly in the beginning of this week's parsha, it seems that maybe now is the moment to take the mask off, to reveal who he truly is, and to now bring about this reconciliation with his brothers. And let me now just pursue this a little further. So if we look at the opening verses, right, let me just find this. This is chapter 45, the continuation in our parsha. So after Judah says what he does, V'lo yachol Yosef lehitapek, Joseph is unable to hold himself back to all those that come near. And he calls and says, take everyone out, and no one remains when Joseph now reveals himself to his brothers. And it says, Vayiten et kolo bifchi, he cries. By the way, I just want to point out, we've seen earlier also in last week's parsha, how Joseph cries, but nobody sees it. This time they do. And if you again go back, if you go back to chapter 42, verses 23 and 24, 42, 23 and 24, after the brothers say, right, we are guilty in what we did to our brother, and it says, and the brothers didn't know that Joseph is listening because there was an interpreter there. And Joseph in verse 24 turns aside and he cries because Joseph is very much moved by what the brothers say. If I go a little bit further in last week's parsha, when Joseph sees Benjamin, if you look at chapter 43, verse 30, okay, it says that Joseph hurries because his compassion is overcoming him. And he wants to cry, and he goes into the room and he cries there. So what we see is that twice Joseph is overcome by emotions when he sees his brothers. And this is the third time. And the third time, Joseph is not going to go away. Joseph is not going to try to hold himself back. But what he will do is to get everybody out of the room. Because this is actually a very, as I said, intimate moment. It's not only that Judah comes near Joseph, but Joseph is actually now coming near to the brothers, not as the Egyptian lord, but as their brother. And then Joseph allows himself. He gives out his Vayiten. This is chapter 45, verse 2, to come back to verse 2. And Joseph begins crying. and Egypt hears, okay, which means Joseph no longer is going to hold back. He's not going to do it privately, okay, because now he is overcome and he wants the brothers to see that. And then look at what Joseph says. And Joseph says to the brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father alive? And the brothers are unable to answer him because they are nivhalu mipanav. They are dumbfounded. They are shocked. Okay, I have on my source sheet. Okay, and this is on the second, or maybe you have it on the third page, after I have the verses from this section. So I have the Abarbanel. And the Abarbanel makes the point, which I think is very interesting. I mean, I said it that this time Joseph is not going to hold him back. This time he's going to actually cry in the presence of his brothers. But the Abarbanel says that the first thing what Joseph says to them is, I am Joseph. Is my brother alive?
My father.
Which means that Joseph says to them is something which is what you might call, this is the language of the Abarbanel, gentle, sensitive. It's not to get into a whole discussion about the sale. It's to reveal himself so that they understand why he's crying, and to also understand to a great extent he's crying and because of exactly what Judah did. Because Judah raised the specter of his father dying, and Joseph now is overcome because his father is his life. And is my father still alive? It's because he wants the brothers to see what you would call the human, sensitive side of Joseph. So if Joseph has gotten, through the various verses that I showed you a few moments ago, a sense of where his brothers are at, it's important for them to get a sense of where Joseph is at. And that Joseph is trying, and this is, as we'll see now through a number of commentaries, is trying in a very delicate manner to show that sense of brotherliness, that sense of love to his brothers. But the brothers are blown away by it. And I'll just quote in verse 3, when it says the brothers were nivhalu, which should be understood as like shocked. I use the term blown away. So it's interesting that there's a discussion among the commentaries. Rashi says, why are they blown away? So Rashi says, mipnei habusha, because they're embarrassed. And this, by the way, is going to be a theme which is going to come up a number of times. The sense of tremendous shame which the brothers feel, as some commentaries describe it, when they are now actually confronting Joseph. Radak brings up another possibility, which is also something which runs throughout the continuing verses. And that is, he says that when Joseph says, come near, and in effect, what Joseph says to them is, you don't have to be embarrassed. You don't have to be ashamed. But Radak says, Joseph is saying, you don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. And that's something which is going to come up a number of times. What you might call suspicion which the brothers have. Now that Joseph is in this position of power, what is he going to do to us? And is this all a facade, right? He's, being really nice to us, setting us up for killing us, or is it genuine? Now, I just want to bring this up now because it also is something which is, I think very important when we talk about this idea of reconciliation. right? We spoke about, well, you have a reconciliation when you have a rift, when you have something that really created a tremendous sense of tension between two sides. And then the question is, how do you somehow diffuse that tension? How do you diffuse that suspicion? And what you see is there has to be a lot of goodwill. There has to be, each side has to be willing to come near to the other side. But it's not something which can just happen immediately. And there's always the sense that even though it seems that they've changed, it seems that they're, really open to having a reconciliation. But in the back of my mind, I'm still very, very suspicious about it. And Rabbeinu Bechaye, right, says very explicitly, he says that, in other words, they are now blown away because they're afraid that now he has the power. He can now pay them back for everything that they did. They're trembling. So I just want you to see that, in other words, that on the one hand, yes, we have the circumstances which can somehow allow for this reconciliation. And yet on the other hand, there is still that suspicion. Is it real? Okay, and so again, if I look at verse 4, Joseph says to them in verse 4, come near, and they do come near. And he says, I am Joseph, your brother, that you sold to Egypt. Now, how do we take that? Now, on the one hand, you could say, by the very fact that Joseph says, not just I'm Joseph, but I'm Joseph, your brother. That's an expression of saying, I want to continue to be your brother. But on the other hand, he says, the one that you sold. Well, why mention that? Are you mentioning that because that's sitting with you and that's something that you're never going to forget and you're going to hold against us? Or are you mentioning that as a way of somehow identifying who you are, as a way of saying, if you had any question who I really am, well, clearly I'm Joseph, because who else would know about the sale? So I'm just trying to show you there's a certain ambiguity over here. And once again,
yes,
Sandra.
What language is he speaking to them in when he's telling them, Geshuna Eli, and I am Joseph, is my father still alive? I always thought it was in Hebrew, and that the switch to Hebrew made the Geshuna real, but I don't know.
Okay, what language is it? So in fact, so I'll just point it out. If you look where, let me just find it. If you look at verse 12.
Okay.
So in verse 12, it says
45:12 in
45:12.
Okay.
It says, and behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, ki fi hamadaber, it's my mouth which is speaking to you. And on that verse, there are a number of commentaries who say that because he's speaking to them in Hebrew.
Good. Great.
Which means that the moment Joseph starts revealing who he is, he speaks to them in Hebrew.
Got it.
Okay, so again, there are many different things which are happening that should convince the brothers that this is Joseph. Right. But what I'm interested in pushing is that not only is this Joseph, but this is Joseph who is looking for a reconciliation. And so therefore, if I go back to what I was going to say a moment ago, it's when Rashi says on verse 4, when Joseph says, come near. So Rashi says, when Joseph saw them moving back, because they were, like I said, in shock, they were taken aback. So he says, no, come near, okay? And he said to them, he's trying to speak to them in a conciliatory, supplicatory manner. Okay, there are commentaries that bring up the fact, and I have it over here, that Joseph actually shows them that he's circumcised as a way of proving that he's, because just to convince them he's the real thing. But I just want to point out there are two different issues here. One issue is he able to convince them that he's Joseph? And I would say absolutely. Are they in a state of shock? Yes. And by the way, this I didn't mention. There are a number of commentators, Rabbeinu Bechaye, who I have on my sheet, Babachia says, that they're in a state of shock. How did Joseph go from being a slave to being, in effect, a king? They can't believe it. If you wanted to add to that, they might be in a state of shock that his dreams actually came true. He did become an extremely powerful individual. It blows their mind. But the point which I wanted to focus on is this issue of reconciliation. And if I would sum up whatever I've been doing till this point, it's that Joseph has been given what we might call ample evidence that the brothers are ripe for a reconciliation, that the brothers have a tremendous sense of remorse, guilt for what they've done to him, a sense that they perhaps should pay a price for what they've done to him. There's a tremendous sense of commitment to each other, especially in terms of the commitment that Judas shows towards Benjamin, a tremendous sense of care for their father, and in no way to bring about some harm to their father. And perhaps it's those factors which ultimately set the background for Joseph being able to now come and reveal himself. And the flip side of the coin, when the brothers see Joseph crying, when the brothers see Joseph doing everything to speak to them in a conciliatory manner, the very fact that Joseph gets everybody out of the room and does not have the Egyptians there, which could be very threatening to them, but wants this to become a very intimate moment between brothers and doesn't want anybody else to know what's gone between them. All of that should be giving a message to the brothers. Let's move forward. And perhaps the crowning element of this is what I mentioned last week. When you look at chapter 45, after Joseph says, right, I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold to Egypt. Joseph then says to them in verse 5, and now, don't be sad. Don't be angry that you sold me, because it's for the purpose of giving life that God has sent me before you. And then in verse 7, and God has sent me before you to provide for you so that you will be able to live and there will be a great survival here. And a third time, verse 8, Ve'ata, and now it's not you who sent me here, it's God, and God has made me, right, a lord to Egypt, and right, to Pharaoh, a father to Pharaoh. Now, I just want to point out, because I always had a slightly different take on this, and there are new facets to Torah every time you study it. I always was bothered by the fact, like, why does Joseph have to really play out how powerful he is? But I want to now say that, so on the one hand, there could be a certain element which could be a veiled threat, like, you better do what I tell you. Or it could be that what Joseph says, I am a master to Pharaoh, but I'm not to you. That's not my relationship with you. My relationship to you is I'm your brother. And so I think that what comes across over here is that Joseph is saying, yes, you sold me, but he keeps on like flipping it on its head. You sold me, and yes, you did have bad intentions, But in the end, it was towards a higher goal. It was ultimately a mission, a service. It's part of a divine plan. Ultimately, what looks like something very negative in the end is actually for something very positive. In fact, this is ultimately to bring about life, the saving, the preserving of life. Now you realize that the moment Joseph says this, it's a way of saying to his brothers, ultimately, I'm here to be able to save you. That's how I see everything. And therefore, how could I possibly want to then do something negative to you if ultimately God wanted me to now save your lives? Yes, Sandra.
So my question is it supposed to lefayes them? Is it supposed to calm them down, make them feel positive towards him, for him to say, your horrible behavior to me, when you beat me up and you stripped me and you tried to kill me and you threw me in a pit with scorpions and then you sold me twice. That behavior? Well, that was all God's plan. Is that, and does that alleviate the awfulness of it? I'm asking this truly, not in a sarcastic way.
No.
Okay, I'm trying to put myself in that position. I have to tell you, I really would be Ashamnu Bagadnu myself into the ground at this point, because here he is, thank God, survived, but look what I did to him. Look what I did. I treated him as less than a human, and he's remembering it, but he's giving me a pass. But I have to tell you, it would kill me.
I would just respond to what you're bringing up. In other words, note the fact that Joseph never says you threw me into a pit. Joseph never says there were snakes and scorpions. Joseph never says you stripped me.
Nope.
Jesus just speaks about the sale.
Yep.
Okay, which means that all
the gory details. It's the best. It's brilliant.
All the gory details he leaves out, which means that, in other words, so that's I think becomes very important. He could have gone into a lot of detail about what they did, which he doesn't, because he doesn't want to harp on it. The one thing which he has to speak about, because clearly that's, at the core of where he is now, is the fact that they sold him into slavery. Okay, so he has to make, but what he does is to take that sale and to flip it on its head and to say that, yes, you sold me into slavery, but ultimately that was a stepping stone to my becoming this powerful person. But my becoming this powerful person is ultimately in order to give you life, which means that what Joseph is doing is saying to his brothers, from my perspective, right, whatever was ultimately has a very, very positive purpose. And that's how I want to look at it.
Okay.
Now, the fact that the brothers will have to live with what they did to Joseph, and the fact that they took responsibility, okay, that's a fact, okay, and they will have to deal with that. You might say, right, again, you might say, well, maybe the brothers have already paid their price by everything that, they've experienced now being put through the ringer, so to speak, by Joseph, and with all the angst which they had. And so maybe, okay, they paid their dues, okay? And there is such a concept, in Jewish law that, God brings, let's say, certain suffering upon people to somehow, pay for what they did. But, so I'm just saying, so you could see it. But what I'm just trying to bring up is that Joseph is doing everything that he can to try to put a positive spin on things, which means that it's, in order to have this reconciliation, it's as if both sides had to go through a transformation. The brothers had to recognize as I said, the horrific nature of what they did to Joseph and how much they are accountable for it. And Joseph has to be able to somehow say, yes, they did this, but in the grand scheme of things, ultimately, there's a positive spin which comes out of this. And that's what I have to really focus on. And I can't be stuck in the past. And I have to be able to see that, in other words, all of this was ultimately to bring about something positive and to work towards that. So that if I look at this opening section, we actually do have all of the elements that can bring about this reconciliation, and that in fact it seems to happen. But I just want to point out, if you look a little bit further down in verse, after Joseph tells him, I want you to go back to our father, tell him everything that's been happening here, and I want you to now bring the whole family down so I can provide for you. Then in verse 14 it says, and Joseph fell on the neck of Benjamin, his brother, the necks, and he cries, and Benjamin cries on Joseph's neck. And then it says in the next verse, Joseph kisses all of his brothers, and he cries upon them. And then it says, and afterwards, the brothers speak to him. So I just want you to see, it's really very interesting that although we do have this reconciliation, there still is a certain distance over here. When it comes to Joseph and Benjamin, each one cries on the other. There really is a sense of what we would call camaraderie, reciprocity. In the case of Joseph and his brothers, Joseph falls on them, he cries, but the brothers don't cry back. The brothers don't kiss back. Okay, the brothers talk to him. Okay, in fact, if you look on in my sheet, okay, on verse 14, where I bring a number of commentaries. Okay, the commentaries see this difference. Okay, and so they try to brush it over. Okay, Rashi in fact says that the brothers, after they see Joseph crying, so then they see that his heart is at one with them. And so that's what opens them up to be able to speak to him. And in fact, the Radak then says, and once Joseph, kissed them and he cries and the brothers see that he really is at one with them. So then they start getting into a whole discussion like what's been happening for the last 22 years. And, so they're able to start really, engaging. But I do want to point out that it is interesting that the brothers don't reciprocate to Joseph. And it is interesting that on a certain level, there is still a certain, if you want to use the language, distancing between Joseph and the brothers. Now, I see this always happens to me. My time is running out. So I want to at least get to one last thing, which is actually not this week's parsha, but next week's parsha. And if you look at next week's parsha, this is after Jacob dies, after the brothers bury Jacob, and then they come back. So look now at this is chapter 50, verse 15. 50:15. And it says the following. And again, I'll just translate it in the English. When the brothers of Joseph see that their father has died, they say, perhaps Joseph will hate us and now return to us all the evil which we caused to him. Now, this is fascinating. And the reason why it's fascinating is I'll just do the simple math for you. Okay, Jacob dies 17 years after he comes down to Egypt, which means we're looking now 17 years after chapter 45, after they had this reconciliation, which means that although 17 years have passed, the minute Jacob dies, the brothers are very, very concerned that maybe Joseph will now see this as the opportunity to now pay them back for everything which they did. And let me just look a little bit further, and then I'm going to come back. And then look at what happens. It says in verse 16, and then they command or send people to command Joseph, saying, your father commanded before his death. So should you say to Joseph, please, this is verse 17, lift up in the sense of forgive the crime of your brothers and the sin, the evil which they did to you. And now please lift up the crime of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph cries when they speak to him. Now, again, we don't have the time to go into this, but it's as if the brothers now are so concerned that Joseph is going to kill them. The only thing which they feel can save them is by invoking some sort of last will and testament of Jacob, that your father commanded right before his death that you forgive the brothers. Now you realize that this is a little bit bogus in the sense that if that were all true, why didn't Jacob actually say that directly to Joseph? I mean, Jacob, will speak about this in next week's Parasha, blesses the sons. He says a whole bunch of things to the sons, especially to Joseph. So, and especially when Jacob, speaks to Joseph at the beginning of next week's Parasha, that would have been the perfect opportunity to say to Joseph, and by the way, after I'm dead, don't do anything to your brothers. I know what happened. And the very fact that Jacob did not say it is clearly someone putting words in the mouth of Jacob. And I would even venture to say that it is highly questionable whether Jacob ever found out what really happened in terms of the story of Joseph and the brothers. And my gut feeling is that both Joseph and the brothers did everything to not tell Jacob what really happened, because had Jacob been aware of it, that would have created a tremendous rift in the family. But it just shows you how much the brothers are still suspicious of Joseph. Now, I just want to point out there are a number of commentaries who actually try to deal with this. How could it be that the brothers are so suspicious, of Joseph after all this time? And so some commentaries say because the brothers thought that for the sake of Jacob, Joseph wouldn't do anything to them, and that Joseph was willing to go through this whole charade because of the tremendous love and respect he had for his father, and in no way wanted to cause his father grief. By the way, remember I said at the beginning that there are parallels between this story and the story of Yaakov and Esav. Well, if you go back to the story of Yaakov and Esav at the end of Parashat Vayigash, right, chapter 27, when Jacob is, about to run away and to go to Haran to find a wife, okay? The motivation for that is because Esav is saying to himself, and it might be not only to himself, but maybe to other people who are around, that I'm not going to do anything right now, but wait till my father dies. And once my father dies, then I'll really take care of Jacob. So if I find that Esav said that, well, maybe the brothers are thinking, well, maybe that's what's going through Joseph's mind right now. So that's one school of thought. Okay? Rashi brings up another thing, which again, you might be able to find some textual support. Rashi says, well, maybe things have changed after Jacob died. As long as Jacob was alive, so the brothers used to be invited to eat at Joseph's table, okay? And Joseph would do everything to, give them time and place. But once Jacob died, so Joseph was like into his own affairs. And maybe that was the brothers, that maybe Joseph is distancing himself, which might be what then started to generate all those fears. Another commentary says that what triggered it is that on the way back from the burial, they actually passed by the pit where the brothers had thrown Joseph. and that when they passed the pit, Joseph made a blessing. Blessed art God who made a miracle for me in this place. And which meant that he hadn't forgotten what had happened in the past. And so again, that triggered, it was a trigger of all these guilt feelings and the concern that Joseph would pay them back. In any case, if we now go back to the verses, chapter 50, Joseph's reaction when he hears is to cry. And the simple pshat is Joseph is crying because he doesn't have any evil intentions towards his brother. He's crying because after all these years, the brothers still are suspicious, are afraid. And look at what happens to reinforce it in verse 18, chapter 50, 18. The brothers come to Joseph, they fall before him. They then send, we are ready to be your servants. And Joseph's response is, don't be afraid. Am I instead of God? And he says to them in verse 20, yes, you thought to do me evil, but God thought to do it good in order to give life to a multitude of people. And once again, he says, and now don't be afraid. I will support you and your children. And at the end of verse 21, and Joseph comforted them. He spoke to their hearts, which means that here is Joseph who's doing everything to say to them, yes, you did do something evil. You wanted to kill me. But God didn't want it. God wanted something good. And what Joseph might be saying over here is that ultimately it's the will of God, which is really what matters. And then when Joseph says to them, am I instead of God? Ultimately, let God decide, right, how to pay you back, but not me. There are certain commentaries who say that when he says, am I instead of God? In other words, Joseph saying, I'm not God. I fear God. And as somebody who fears God, I'm not going to take revenge against you. Because I understand that ultimately, as I said, the purpose of whatever happened was to bring about life. But for our purposes, the important point is, and Joseph comforted them. Joseph spoke upon their heart. Joseph found a way to somehow allay their fears and to be able to bring about, as I said, this reconciliation. So what I think becomes extremely important is that on the one hand, here are the brothers who do learn to acknowledge the horrific thing which they did to Joseph, who are prepared to pay the price for it. And here's Joseph, who was able to be magnanimous and was able to say to the brothers that, don't be afraid. I will not do anything to you. I don't want to end on this note, because I'll actually end on a more positive note. But on verse 17 in my source sheet, right towards the end, I have Rabbeinu Bachya, who says a line which is fascinating. And I mean, he says it's a long piece, but I just want to take one thing, which he essentially says. He says that the brothers were looking for Joseph to forgive them. And he says, in fact, Joseph never actually says, I forgive you. And it's fascinating because he says that the fact that Joseph didn't actually say, I forgive you, and he actually quotes a Gemara, and Maimonides codifies this, that the Gemara and Maimonides say that if you sin against someone else, in order to get atonement, you have to get their forgiveness. And if they don't forgive you, then you will have to live with what you did forever. And Rabbeinu Bechaye then says something which is a radical statement, which is, and it may very well be, because Joseph did not explicitly forgive his brothers, that sin was held up not only on the head of the brothers, but on the head of the Jewish people for generations, and then found its expression in what happened later on in Jewish history in what is known as the 10 martyrs. If you're familiar with the elegy to the 10 rabbis who were murdered, right, which we say on Tisha B'Av, which we say on Yom Kippur, you mentioned it in the Musaf of Yom Kippur, the repetition of the Musaf, of these 10 rabbis, right? And it's all based on a certain Midrashic comment. So he says that maybe this is the basis for this Midrash, that Joseph never explicitly said to the brothers, I forgive you. And by not saying it, it's as if that was a kind of mark of Cain, which is on the Jewish people forever. Now, I bring this point up because the whole point of what I was trying to say in the shir tonight was to really highlight, this reconciliation, this reunification of the family, the effort that both sides were making to make it happen. And what I tried to also show you, although there are a few other things I wanted to do, which unfortunately I didn't get to, that it seems that the brothers in the back of their mind are always suspicious that maybe Joseph still has it in for them. And although Joseph seems to do everything to allay their fears, and maybe in the end does allay their fears, and does bring about this reconciliation, but it is interesting that Joseph never says explicitly to the brothers, I forgive you. And maybe that's something which holds back that complete reconciliation. So I just want to end with the following. Yes, the family of Jacob is able to bring about a reconciliation. There is a reunification. In many ways, this is a corrective of the story of Yaakov and Esav, where theoretically, right, there should have been that reconciliation between Yaakov and Esav, and that maybe the two of them could have become the founders of the Jewish people. But it's worth noting that reconciliation was torn apart later in the book of Kings, when we have the split between the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, when we have ultimately the 10 tribes who go into exile. And to this very day, right, we don't know where they are and who they are, and the sense that on some level, right, the Jewish people have been torn apart. So I just would like to end with what actually is the haftarah for this week's parsha from Ezekiel, chapter 37, verse 15, okay, where Ezekiel essentially is told by God, take 2 sticks. On one stick you should write Judah, and on one stick you should write Israel. And essentially what he says is, bring them close to each other so that they become one stick. And this is the vision of the ultimate reconciliation, reunification of the Jewish people, which we hope will happen in the time of the Messiah, maybe even before, that somehow that there is that need for that bringing together once again of Judah and Joseph. Okay, so I just want to end with this note that evidently reconciliation, reunification, is something which is a challenge that has always been before the Jewish people. And there are many, many different factors that can certainly tear us apart. And what I was trying to show, at least from this week's parsha, is that if you want to bring about that reconciliation, it takes a lot of goodwill on both sides. It requires both sides to be able to take responsibility for the past and ultimately to see how to move forward in the future. And it has a lot of ups and downs.